really excited to be closing out this conference. Really thrilled to be here. Thank you for putting on such a good conference. And yeah, let's get into it. My first basically confession here, where I want to start out as, is that I had planned to give a completely different talk today to close this out. If you don't know my work, I'm Fred K. Schott on Twitter, and I am most known right now for helping to create Astro. So Astro is this really cool site builder. If you haven't checked it out, go and check it out. It's basically less than a year old, but it won the Ecosystem Innovation Award at last year's Jamstack conference. It is essentially what if React server components, but available today and for any framework. So server-side render your site, inject cool React components or Vue, and don't pay the cost of anything that isn't dynamic on the client. It's super cool. It's super exciting. It's a really interesting take on web development, and it's getting a lot of buzz, and we're really excited to keep working on this and growing it. That was going to be my talk. I was going to walk through Astro, show all these cool features. For now, just go to astro.build to check that out, because we have something much more important to talk about. While I was doing research for this talk, I love Jamstack. It's modern web development. It sounds great. It feels great. You go to jamstack.org, the modern way to build websites and apps that delivers better performance. Like, sign me up. That's awesome. And I thought I knew what Jamstack was. JavaScript, APIs, markup, JAM, that's the jam in Jamstack, right? And as I started researching this topic, I realized something very weird and scary and odd, and I threw out my talk, and now this is an intervention. So I'm here to start an intervention. What I learned was that no one is on the same page about what Jamstack means today. I think we all think we are, but I don't think anyone would actually agree on the definition of Jamstack today. It's a term from 2016. It made a lot of sense. It was pretty literal then. And now today, I think there's this open question of what is Jamstack, where some people are really clinging to the old definition, and others are super ready to open that definition up for a much larger, bigger tent, right? Modern way, websites and apps, better performance. Some people very strict on the definition, others, well, if it does these things, maybe it's Jamstack. And I think this is important because it seems really critical that we figure out what Jamstack is. Maybe we won't all agree, but if this is a really big thing about Jamstack right now, for example, there is the unofficial jamstack.wtf, and it's also an explainer for what Jamstack is. Really cool guide, also very interesting. It does a good job of explaining it. The way they sum up the last year of Jamstack is, and this is the site that explains what Jamstack is. While Jamstack continues to expand, confusion about what it really means has become a common theme. And yet, Redwood.js and Blitz.js show us that Jamstack isn't slowing down. Both of these tools aren't really traditional Jamstack by that traditional definition, and yet here they are showing that Jamstack continues to evolve. And so, as I was doing this research, I saw this common theme of, like, every article about Jamstack had to start with, well, while no one can agree on what Jamstack is, well, ... And so I want to have this conversation. I can't think of a better platform than the closing keynote of a Jamstack conference to let's start an intervention. Let's start a conversation. I don't have all the answers. I'm just a fan of the web. I am not a thought leader, hashtag thought leader in the Jamstack community. Astro is a site builder, so naturally we want to support Jamstack sites. But this feels really interesting, really relevant to where Jamstack is today. And so I want to talk about it. And I have some thoughts. I definitely have some thoughts here, but I'm also really interested to hear what everyone else has to say. I think there'll be a fireside chat after this, or Q&A, so plenty to get into here. But if this can start the conversation about what Jamstack is today, then I'll be happy. So as I did the research here, I think what first tipped me off, again, there's a lot of good stuff to like on jamstack.org about a really flexible definition. But if you go back to the talk that Matt gave in 2016, and this is Matt who founded Netlify, the original definition of Jamstack has its kind of origin in this talk. If you go back and watch it, it's super interesting because it has, I don't know if anyone's watched the React, Facebook explaining React for the first time at JSConf. This was maybe almost 10 years ago now, 8 years ago. It has the same thing where today we see these things as like givens, right? React, component, UI, it all makes sense. Svelte, Vue, we're all doing different iterations on that same concept. But that talk where Facebook had to pitch the idea of a component written in JavaScript and to an audience of people only doing model view controller, which was this older way of thinking of your front end. you can see it's like you're talking to a totally different audience that has different conceptions about what web development is and isn't. And this talk that Matt gives is very similar. It's an audience that is maybe working with PHP, maybe Rails, where they have this idea of what web development is as this relationship between a server and a front end. And Matt is explaining like, no, there's actually a different way of doing things. And that's what became Jamstack. Go watch the talk. It's really interesting to go and look back at what this looked like in 2016. I took some notes here. I basically pulled out the main themes from this talk. So this is kind of what I'd call the like maximalist Jamstack like definition. This is the original definition, was actually pretty strict about what Jamstack was and wasn't. So JavaScript APIs Markdown, that's a really loose definition of what it, like any site has some combination of those generally, today at least. But there were actual real definitions in that talk that Matt went into. And so there were some themes around how Jamstack was more secure by pre-building your site ahead of time. There was no WP admin to hack into, right? Your admin console was separate from your main production site that you were sending to users. The reliability of building your site ahead of time meant that you were essentially just serving static assets. There was no every user hitting the same API, doing the same amount of work. You could basically preload all that work and then ship that to the user. So almost never going down. If you imagine back, at 2016, that like hug of death was a thing where if you got popular on Hacker News or Reddit, all of a sudden your site just went down. Like couldn't handle the fact that you went from 1 user a day to 1 user a second, and it would just die. And that was something that Jamstack was like, well, if you pre-build it, the user's loading this static content. That's not so much. You can scale that. Especially when you start to bring in a CDN, you can scale that all over the globe. And that scaling, performance, CDN, all of that spoke to a story of performance where if it's static, it can load really quickly. Now, that's kind of the main definition here, and it was tied to this idea that you could build your site ahead of time, use a CDN in front of it so it would go around the globe faster. And then there was all these cool features around that, around deployments, caching, how your builds were managed and automated. But that pre-building of markup is the one that seems to be the most interesting today. Because at the time, it was basically saying, don't use Rails and PHP, use a site builder like 11D or Hugo or Jekyll, or really Create React app could even be tied back to that, where it doesn't matter what you're shipping to the user, it's just the idea that it's not generated dynamically. So Create React app is a great example of something that is essentially just an empty HTML page. You're shipping JavaScript static for every user the exact same, and then it's running on the client to hydrate that site, build that site, generate it. That was a Jamstack site. And some of the first, like, especially around that time, past companies I've worked at, we used Create React app. It gave you this really nice, like, I'm thinking of my website as an application that I'm building, I'm talking to APIs, I'm using React. It was like this really happy place for a developer to live. The big problem, and I think why Jamstack is having a sort of crisis right now around this definition, is it was very easy to build a slow Jamstack site. Again, Create React app was really great developer experience, pretty poor user experience, because there was no sort of pre-rendering built in. So your whole site was shipped to the user as JavaScript, essentially a blank page, and then they would have to render it with JavaScript. So you're waiting for that JavaScript to load, you're waiting for it to run, you're waiting for it to parse. JavaScript's a really expensive asset, and if you're putting it in a blocking place and your whole app is built with it, you really quickly run into performance problems. So that was the kind of problem. It's like, well, okay, I'm following Jamstack. I have this great deployment scalability, but I'm still able to build a slow site. And that's really tough to get around if it's, one of the easiest ways, in that it's just kind of anyone can use Create React app. It's really popular, but is it making it easy for me to build a fast site? The other thing that came along then is this idea of Next.js. So Next.js all of a sudden brought in some ideas from the non-Jamstack world, right? I want to actually render this dynamically. That's huge no-no in the definition of Jamstack at that time. We want to render ahead of time so that there's no server running to render the page that could go down or be hacked. And Next.js was like, well, no, we'll do this rendering ahead of time. And maybe it is tied to the user, maybe it is dynamic, but this is going to help the user get a fast site. So they get pre-rendered HTML. And then, we have to do a lot of JavaScript loading the same way Create React app does, but at least the user can see something. So all of a sudden they added that idea of like, let's dynamically render this page. maybe based on what the user sent, maybe each request is different, it's dynamic, but we'll still have all the other benefits of Jamstack. So Next.js, I think, is probably the most, I mean, lots of different site builders started. Nuxt was around the same time, Gatsby around the same time. But Next.js, I think, pushed that definition the furthest, where all of a sudden is that model necessarily bad? If you're looking at it purely from, is it meeting the definition of Jamstack? Then the answer is no, that's not Jamstack. But if you start to be a little flexible with the how and start to just look back at the definition of why Jamstack is great, I don't think it's that far off from Matt's original intention. And again, I can't speak to the original, what it was like to be in 2016, what their original intention was. But watching that talk and judging the values that we're seeing in it, really, I think it was this fourth one that seemed to be taking up the most interest from why Jamstack was great. That was the decoupling of the front end and the back end. And this is something that no matter what you're using, whether it's a static site builder or a dynamic Next.js Svelte kit, something that's building your front end and has some dynamic capabilities, in either case, that's a really important thing that we didn't have 10 years ago, was this idea that a front-end website is actually different from your backend API. And you can give a front-end team the website and then have it talk to the backend team through an API. And all of a sudden, there's that really nice decoupling where I worked, I won't say the name of the company, but one of my first jobs was at a company, and I think 3 separate instances of realizing that there was a really critical security bug that if you just click this one page and then that page, you could trick the site into thinking you're an admin and get to a page that you weren't supposed to and see data you weren't supposed to. And it was a nightmare because the UI could take you into some path that you weren't meant to be in. Versus if you decouple the two and have a really strong contract of an API, the front end and the back end can talk across that API. You can secure that API. There's no, if I'm on this page, I can get to something that I'm not supposed to. You just have an API that's much more strictly written and behavioral and really much easier to reason about versus all the complexity of the front end taking you in all these different paths. That doesn't have to impact your business logic. And so I personally feel like this was I cannot thank this movement enough for pushing that. Funny enough, I'll just bring up this old article. This is from almost 10 years ago now, on a team that I worked on with Nicholas Sakis, who, if you don't know him, created ESLint, does a lot of writing, super smart. This is one of the first projects I ever worked on, which was this idea of, at Box at the time, we were going through a similar kind of crisis, which is what is the front end in a world where Node exists? Box had traditionally been PHP. There's this idea of the UI kind of being the separation between backend and front end. And the front end essentially being a way to modify the backend that had generated the HTML. So like that traditional PHP generating HTML, your front end's just making it interactive, but not doing any sort of generation. Real old school stuff before React was really a thing that we could use. And this is going to feel really old school. No one thinks about it this way now. But we essentially, and Nicholas really started to reason about this idea of Node.js being the presentation layer. And all of a sudden, the front-end developer using a back-end server to reason about their front end. Again, this is still talking about Node generating UI and the front end hydrating it versus, again, React didn't really exist. But even now, we're starting to see what it meant to decouple the back end from the front end. And really, business logic lives on the server, API, website owns the front end, and that's all well and good. And so I don't think that this is too different and too far off from where Jamstack is starting to be pushed now, where that decoupling and that simplicity that comes from that is really where I see the value in when I think of what a modern web app is or a modern website is. It's that you can own a full experience from server to front end, and you get that decoupling so that you're not worrying about how does this backend get powered? What is the business? I can talk to APIs. I can leverage AWS or Vercel and all these great things. And I can just think about building the best website possible. And what didn't exist back in 2016, Netlify, Vercel, these were much simpler ideas around really deploying a server somewhere. But this idea of letting the platform that gets built honestly take on that responsibility. So, anyone using one of the Netlify or Vercel or Cloudflare, you're getting a CDN for free. Right? Regardless of what you're building, the CDN is not tied to it being Jamstack or not. It's there. It's there for you to use. Atomic deploys, automating your builds, using Git, all these great powers aren't actually tied to the, is this static or dynamic? I think that is the one thing that we seem to be holding on to the most. but it really doesn't feel like it's actually giving us as much as we thought. If we can trust our platform to scale for us, right? If I can trust that Vercel or Netlify is going to scale that work across thousands of different cloud workers, or Cloudflare workers if you're using Cloudflare, Lambdas if you're using AWS, right? All of a sudden the platform's taking on the scalability concerns. So the static versus dynamic becomes less about me needing to scale, right? The hug of death is not going to be impacted by my cloud functions if they're running on AWS. You still have the database to worry about, but I would argue that that usually would be hit anyway by something that was dynamic anyway. So if the content was loading an e-commerce store, Jamstack would say that should be loaded and fetched client side. Like, I need to know the stock is dynamic. Is this in stock or out of stock? Let me make an API call. We're just moving that work onto the server instead of only on the front end, but it's still happening. So I think there's this really interesting question. If you need something dynamic, is it breaking the Jamstack contract to move that work to a server if we can trust that server can scale? And that's where I think we need to expand the Jamstack definition. I think that's where Jamstack means a lot more today in terms of what it used to, where there wasn't really this platform you could depend on to handle the security, the reliability, and the performance. Instead, you really had to make this dramatic, static or dynamic, choose one, and that's it. I really love these new platforms like Netlify and Vercel that allow you to not really think about the scaling, let them handle it. And then you can run logic on the server without worrying about it breaking your site. As long as you're thinking of your site as a single thing, a single website, it's not actually shipping off a product if you click the buy button, it's not sending an email. Those can be handled by backend services. As long as I just think of this website as a single thing that I'm building and it can talk to APIs, then whether it's running on a server or only in the client becomes a lot less of an issue for whether I'm doing something good or bad in an architectural sense. Instead, I can really align that with the use case, right? Am I trying to build something that needs to be dynamic? Well, then I'll run it on the server, right? So that users always get really up-to-date information and they don't have to render it themselves. And if it's static, I can build it ahead of time. Great, I'll build it ahead of time. That's something I can do because this is a marketing site and it's not changing. And I think that freedom isn't actually at odds with what Jamstack means in 2022. And that's where I'd like to see the web go. And I'd like to see this definition grow a bit. So if I could sum this take up, and where I would love to see us kind of open our minds a bit, it's that Jamstack, I don't think needs to be this rigid definition that only a certain statically generated site fits. I think that really pushed us way further back in 2016 into this new world that we felt like we have so much to thank for that definition to push our idea of what a website is and isn't. But at the same time, now that we have more technology, more power at our fingertips, I think we can take on that growing definition and not sacrifice too much. I think Next.js, SvelteKit, Astro is currently static, but we're definitely exploring SSR. All these ideas about running a server to power your site, I don't think are at odds with, again, going back to what Jamstack really seems to be pushing, is this idea of better performance, this idea of maintainability, of decoupling. These are the things that I love about Jamstack. These are the things that I want to see continue to grow. And I don't think we should limit ourselves to this really rigid definition that can't change over time and evolve over time as the web grows. So that's my take. I obviously, again, I'm not an authority. I'm not telling you to change your mind. But if you are someone who is thinking of Jamstack as a really rigid thing, that was a definition created 7 years ago now, is that right? 5, 7, 6? Either way, that's fine, but also maybe not so much. maybe there's a benefit to opening this definition up to the people who are using tools that challenge that really early rigid construction. And instead, what are they trying to get out of Jamstack? What do we get when we bring a new tool in? Can we grow this tent without losing anything that we really, really care about when we talk about what makes Jamstack great? I think we can, and that's my pitch. And hopefully this has been entertaining, and hopefully you all have enjoyed this. And thank you for the time. And thank you for everyone who gave a great talk and for the conference in general. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fred. That was great. Super thought-provoking. I have so many questions I want to ask. And for all of you attendees, if you have any questions, you can hit the ask a question button at the bottom of your screen, add them, and we'll keep an eye on them. But first, I want to bring Brian back on stage, and we'll put Fred in the hot seat to answer some of these questions. And you know, Brian recently wrote he wrote a great article that is really right in line with or at least in the same topic of this last talk. And so I want to hand it over and let Brian kick things off with the first question.
Thanks, Fred. That was amazing. Very thought-provoking. I think, you know, your talk of expanding the definition kind of reminds me a little bit of, if you've seen like Brian LaRue talk about functional web apps, and other folks have kind of brought the, like even the Remix folks are kind of going down this route of like, it doesn't matter if it's static, you know, we're basically achieving the same result. And I do think there's a strong, there's a lot of value in that. At the same time, like I also feel like, okay, well, then what is Jamstack anyway? It's just web development in general. It's like, okay, so that's where I kind of struggle. Like, where do you feel like? I mean, do you feel like if you go that route, I mean, is the Jamstack term even useful anymore?
Yeah, I really struggled with not coming up with my own dumb acronym, which would have just been really, I think, fallen flat. So I didn't even go down that route. Yeah, I think we get so like, we lose sight of what we're building a lot in kind of the larger sense. I at least personally do. And I think it's fairly unique and fairly new still to think of the website as the thing, right? I have a Git repo that is the website or the web app if I'm building something more dynamic. And that, again, going back through these old talks and through articles about what people love about Jamstack, that seems to give us everything around the simplicity and the ability to reason of the front end as a thing that I can own as a developer. And so I'm not having to go and talk to the backend team to generate my API. I'm not having to learn Rails, Ruby, and JavaScript. Like, it's that idea that I can just kind of work in my own world and have a lot more autonomy over what the website is as a front end developer. So it's that mix of like empowerment, but also simplicity. I think we get lost in the like, well, this technical thing versus this other technical thing. And instead, I think the ideas behind it are still pretty solid, even if you challenge the how a little bit more.
Yeah, that's great. Sean, are you there? I seem to have lost the feed.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Okay. Here I'm. Okay. Well. All right. So switching gears slightly, you mentioned like coining another term or coming up with an acronym. So, question: what do we do about all of the acronyms? It's like every framework or company that pops up has their own take and like their methodology of the way they're solving the problem, but it's led to a lot of overlapping concepts, and now somebody coming into the industry has given like just loads and loads of acronyms and has to make sense of that. So like what do we do about that?
Yeah. What do we have? We have SSR, ISR, DSP.
ISR, yeah. Yeah, there's
there others?
DSG. Yeah.
It's a lot. Yeah, I think it definitely shows that like no one's on the same, like it's not a solved problem about which of these is best. I think maybe everyone wants to have their own unique take because everyone else has their own unique take. So it makes you feel special, right? Like, no, that's all flawed and ours is the best. And what's that XKCD, like 15 standards, we're going to create the other final standard and now there's just 16. You've only just created another option. I don't know. I think that it's tough. It's a lot of what it means to statically build a site versus dynamically building a site. We think of it as two very different things. We need to like bridge them so that you can kind of do each one when you need it. I would love to see the web and just the way this platform works. If I can make one kind of appeal would be, and I don't know which, this is probably one of the acronyms already. So maybe this is me just pushing for one acronym over another, but there's this really nice thing. If you can just think of the whole thing is, when do I build this page? You get a really nice simplicity to that, where it's not like, do I build it and then revalidate it? Do I build it ahead of time, but then what happens if that data changes? If you can just think of it all as like a build of a page, and maybe I build that page in the server and by a user hitting it, so it gets hit and then it gets cached for later, or maybe I build it ahead of time. But these feel like different camps, and really it's just everyone having different answers to, when do I build this page? Ahead of time, dynamically, when every user comes in, do I cache it? They're all just different takes, and I think that's why there are so many, is because different options in the space have different pros and cons. There's not really a one size fits all. I think the acronyms make it all seem more complicated than it needs to be. At the end of the day, everyone's just trying to answer that, like, when do I build this thing? And then once I've built it, how long can I keep it for? That really depends a lot on your use case, and there is no one good answer.
Yeah, this is where like I ended up writing a post about this as well, and presenting about like all the different rendering type, and it all ends up being like, do I do it beforehand? Do it pre-render? Do I do it like on the server? Do I do it, obviously you can then refresh it, invalidate the cache, or even like, do I modify the rendering on the edge and like an edge function or something like that? And it does get complicated. More options, more power, more complications.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. So, and this, going back to this discussion of how we define it, is if do you still feel there's value in pre-rendering parts? Obviously, I mean, I feel like you do, because Astro is like basically all pre-rendered at this point. Like, I mean, is there, even if you're, because this is the argument I hear from folks, is like, if you're server-side rendering stuff and you can add a cache to that, like, is there any value at all in pre-rendering stuff?
There's definitely value in the simplicity of like, here's some assets, you host them and put them up there. Like, giving any one of your hosts, whether it's Vercel or Netlify or like an S3 bucket, a set of static assets is a lot easier than giving it a server that has to be run in a certain environment. And are your secrets working? Is it distributed? Is it fast? There's a really nice simplicity story. The problem is that it has trouble scaling to some use cases, especially as a site gets big. So Astro is a static site builder. It's clearly a case that I really care about, but also it's really hard to have an answer for someone who says, great, I have 100,000 markdown pages and Astro is taking a long time to build. How do I fix this? And that's a really hard problem to have an answer for. I think 11 is actually probably the best example of a static site builder that realized it needed some answer, where if you have 100,000 pages, unless you're one of the most popular sites on the world, probably not everyone's viewing those pages. So you're doing a lot of unnecessary work if you're building them all ahead of time. There's good options for each use case, where if you have a simple dev blog, I love building a static site for that. Like, I think astro.build, our homepage, is a static site. It makes a ton of sense. But it's really hard to choose something that's one size fits all, that's so limited. And I think a lot of the best tools in the space are doing something that lets you start there, but then add some dynamic ability when you need it. Others, I think SvelteKit is just like, nope, it's all dynamic, and you can opt out in certain cases. But I think starting simple and static and then expanding more is definitely the way I'd like to see other sites go. The one thing that exists that is really interesting, and this is like, I wonder if the platforms like Netlify and Vercel are thinking about this. When you deploy something to Vercel, the first thing you see is a screenshot of that site. So they're doing it as a feature, like, look, here's your homepage. Like, you can now click it. Like, when you see us in the dashboard, you're going to know which site this is because it's a screenshot of your homepage. What that's doing behind the scenes is also like building that page, right? So you've essentially, the platform has automatically pre-rendered that homepage because it needed to create the screenshot. So regardless of whether it was built statically or generated at runtime, the first thing Vercel did was run and build that homepage. And so I wonder if there's some idea that hasn't been explored that involves the platform being the static builder, where could you deploy it as a runtime and a dynamic thing, that then the platform, the first thing it does, maybe even as a part of your build, is go and warm up the cache on all those pages. And instead of that being a tooling problem, like the tool has to be built ahead of time, it's like a deployment problem. I go to deploy it, the platform warms these pages up. If any of them fail, then the whole build fails because they own that kind of deployment. I would love to see more experimentation in that because it would just simplify a lot. Again, this is me as a tooling author talking, but if I could trust that the platform would warm up these pages for me, well, then all of a sudden you have a dynamic site builder that can handle a lot of static things. And it could be smart. It could say, all right, what are the 10 most popular pages, the 100 most popular pages? I'm going to go warm those up. There's a lot of simplicity in that model as well, where it might not be as easy to deploy as a static site, but at least you can stop thinking about this pre-rendering versus building and running it dynamically and let the platform just kind of do its best to optimize your site for you without you worrying about it.
We do have a couple of audience questions. I don't know if you were going to get to those, Sean. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, no, that's it. Yeah, I was going to say, like, that's super interesting. I want to dig into it, but we have a couple questions. So I'll read the first one, and you can take the second one, Brian. So the first one comes to us from Chris, and he says, if the definition is growing and expanding, then maybe it's not a stack anymore and just a piece of web development or a platform overall now. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was more behind so I don't remember when this happened, but like JAM were all capitals. And then all of a sudden they weren't. Like it went from Jamstack, the acronym, to just like Jamstack, the word. And I think that could just be like a little editorial style change, but maybe there are people thinking about this even within, I don't know who owns the word Jamstack, if anyone does, but I think that is probably, yeah, if that's a Netlify project, maybe Netlify is already thinking in this way. Like, can we stop thinking of it as an explicit stack and start thinking of it more as a brand and an ideal? And instead of the how, we can focus on the, if it's these things, then no matter how you built it, we want to think of that as the modern web. The other problem is just there's a lot of like companies involved. There's a lot of options now. If I'm building a company, I want to be the best X for Jamstack. I want that to mean a lot of things. I want everyone to think, great, I'm going to pay this company money. So there's also like weird incentives around how big Jamstack has gotten, where you kind of want it to be a big tent if you were someone who is trying to build a tool for this audience. Like if you're an analytics provider for Jamstack, you don't really care if it's a static site or a dynamic site. At least I don't think you do. So I think a lot of people want this definition to grow. I think it's just a question of, does that sacrifice anything? And can we think of Jamstack as an ideal and not an explicit, these three things?
For what it's worth, I remember the conversation around that, getting rid of the capital JAM, and it was like there was a lot of thought put into why they were doing that, and because as a stack, like the JAM part, look, at the time it kind of made sense. Now it's like, okay, what site doesn't use JavaScript APIs?
Right.
So like it doesn't make a lot of sense, and it's not really a stack is usually prescriptive, and this is not at all prescriptive. But let me get to the next question. So the question is, Shakespeare's jab, quote, "What's in a name, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet," could be read literally or understood as the rose, competing theater to Shakespeare's The Globe. A smell sweet as, well, poop. Hygiene was utterly bad. Do you see a point of inclusion of concepts, elements where the name isn't true to its core meaning anymore? That's a very deep question.
I think it might be the first question ever quoting Shakespeare that I've ever had to answer. I'm honored. Yeah. I mean, I think I agree with that main point. It's, I think, a question of, are we getting as much out of the limitations, the strict definition of Jamstack, as we are out of a more loose definition? And that's, I think my argument is that the real benefits, at least that I see in Jamstack in my own work and when I read about what other people love about it, it's this idea of simplicity, decoupling, and performance. And yeah, I just don't see the value in being so strict about it anymore. I don't think, especially given where Jamstack has led us in a strict definition, if the definition doesn't help you build a fast site, or if the definition limits you where I have to feel like I'm, breaking the rules of Jamstack to build an e-commerce site because I want it to be dynamically loading some sort of dynamic data about stock and what sizes are available. If we can still offer the same user experience, or maybe even a better user experience, and if we can offer the same developer experience and maybe even a better developer experience, then I think that the new definition just has more use and doesn't have to be as restrictive. But I don't know. I think you could go either way. It's a philosophical question for sure.
So on that note, if we go back again to the beginning days of Jamstack, it felt like it was created almost in response to like the WordPresses and the monoliths at the time, and almost felt like an opposite sort of pattern. And even yesterday, we heard a talk where someone was building a site with a WordPress backend and a Gatsby front end, and so WordPress used to be the enemy. Is what you're suggesting, would you say, does WordPress fit into your definition? Can WordPress be Jamstack, or maybe if not, what is it about WordPress that makes it not able to be Jamstack, or in what situations?
Yeah. I mean, it's the funniest thing. I mean, maybe not funny, maybe it's sad. In our own web analytics for basically every project I've ever worked on, there is like one of the most popular URLs that gets hit is /WP engine. And I haven't built any of those as WordPress sites /WP admin. I think that's the one. The one that's like everyone's trying to hack it. They're trying to see if you have it available, and then they're going to try every password, and they're going to try and hack you. And again, I think that's where the decoupling definition does most of the work, where if your site is only, let's say it's dynamic, let's say it is similar to WordPress in that it is a living, breathing thing. But if it's talking to an API, you're still getting a lot of that security, right? Like at that point, what are you doing hacking the front end and hitting an endpoint? Because at the end of the day, it's going to have to go through the API. The security story there ends up being a lot stronger, even if it is dynamic. So I think what WordPress, and I don't mean to use them as a punching bag here, I think you could say it for anything like Rails or a PHP, where the business logic, which encompasses a lot of the security aspects of your site, is tied to the UI generation. And I hit this URL and something happens, like that can be really dangerous. Or I hit this URL and I end up getting access to something I shouldn't, and then I can perform actions, and maybe I didn't add the right checking there because I assumed that I was going to build this only for an admin. You end up, your error surface just becomes as complex as your UI, instead of being as complex as the functionality, which is what an API provides more. It's, hey, here are the 10 things you can do, and we'll just put a check for authentication in front of each of those. That's where I think the definition really gets me excited about the value that I'm getting by just following these rules. I get that for free. On top of the fact that that team, as I grow, might end up being a large team that needs all this complexity. They're trying out a new database. They're trying out some new technology behind the scenes. That API doesn't have to change. That API stays, they are doing that invisibly. I'll never even notice. It's this really nice like contract layer between two different types of development. And that's, I think, the real benefit that a WordPress or a Rails or a PHP app doesn't traditionally give you. It certainly can, but WordPress especially, it's all one big mixed up thing that can be really risky.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I also think it's interesting what you mentioned about that once the businesses got into Jamstack and everybody's got a business around Jamstack, well then I don't want to limit my audience to just companies or people who want to pre-render most of their pages, and so the broader the definition of Jamstack, the better for us to sell to Jamstack folks. And there's a good point in that. And at the same time, for me as a developer, I think I don't know if you got to read my post, but my feeling as a developer is like, well, there was a kind of, I hate this kind of maybe bad way to put it, but a glorious simplicity to Jamstack that drew me to it like early on, and I knew it didn't fit every single kind of site, and I could build lots of kinds of sites with it, but like there may be cases where like, hey, I that's probably not a good fit for Jamstack, and you know what, that's fine. I know other things I can build using other ways of building sites, and so part of me feels like, well, if we restricted the definition, but said, hey, you know what? If you need to add in SSR, we're not saying like, hey, you're still using some Jamstack principles, maybe pre-rendering a bunch of your site and doing this stuff, but like, that doesn't mean you've broken some kind of contract. You're just, there's lots of tools, and this is just a kind of set of concepts that strive, push you to kind of pre-render as much as you can and build things as simple as possible and stuff like that. Like the smaller definition to me feels more comfortable, but that's just, I feel like I'm fighting against the current here.
Yeah, I mean, we see that all the time with static sites being built with Astra, where it's, I think that's the problem, is that if the methodology doesn't scale with whatever it is you're building, right? So from 1 page to 10 to 100 to 1,000 to 100,000 to 1,000,000, it means you're buying into something, and then you're all of a sudden fighting with your own definition. You're fighting with the tools you've chosen. A good methodology, I think, should scale with whatever it is you're building and keep helping you, versus something, oh, this is only for simple, like simplicity as a thing that only exists for simple sites, versus, hey, here's a methodology that will keep your development simple no matter how big it is. I think that's the thing that's missing in the like static part of what Jamstack is, where if I can use a tool that maybe lets me start static and simple and then can evolve over time, I think that's a much better way to help users feel like they can bet on this thing and that it will scale as they grow, versus feeling like they're making a decision on day one that maybe is going to bite them, on day 1,000. Growing with you just feels like this really important part of what Jamstack should be to help as many users as possible.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think we've gotten there to the point where like you could do I could use like Next.js and build it could be all static, but then I can also start to add in SSR.
Yeah.
I think that's where like I'm like, I worry we get away to like where, okay, well, everything's just server rendered and like is that like, and maybe that's okay, for everything. I just feel like there's still value in pre-rendering stuff, and even the simplicity of deployment and all that other stuff, like really, that there's value in that. But
yeah, I think that's the dream scenario for me, is if you can start with a tool, it's static, it lets you get started, and then if that's as big as your site ever is, that's great. And then if you need to grow, it can still kind of shepherd you through that transition. I think, and maybe this is where some of the kind of push-pull comes, is because Jamstack so firmly sat in the original definition of this is static, that then to break free of that, we had to not only break that, but say it's dynamic is good. Like, if we had never talked about static versus dynamic, if that had never been a part of the definition, I don't think we'd be talking about it as much today either. I think it's almost in response to that we feel like it's something we need to address, versus if we're just agnostic to that question, let different tools solve it in different ways. And I feel like one that helps you go from one to the other as you scale would win out ultimately.
Right, absolutely. We used to call it static sites, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Where that comes from, that debate comes from, because it was literally, I wrote a book called Working with Static Sites, so.
We fall into that trap all the time. So much of Astra's original, like, what is an Astra site? We had to say like, well, it's not an SPA, even though we let you use your favorite framework. And it's, okay, well then we have to call ourselves an MPA. And it's like, is that acronym even helping anyone? Like, all of a sudden you're being defined by the thing that you are trying to move past. I think that happens to a lot of different things, but we've definitely seen that in Astra, where we're trying to pitch what's so great about Astra, and I think people are trying to slot us into what are you the opposite of, in a way that, and Remix, I think Remix is having this trouble with Next, where they're trying to define themselves as, everyone is asking, how is this different from Next? And they get stuck, I think, in that trap where they end up trying to tell a performance story, and it's kind of similar. They're telling a usability story. It's still React, but there's all this cool stuff they're doing about form components and the fact you can deploy to the edge that Next.js can't even do. And that's where I get excited about tools and technology like that. If they're doing something totally new that's pushing the bar, it's a much more fun way to look at the tool and kind of evaluate it on its own merits.
Absolutely.
Fred, really, really good. I know we're out of time. I think Sean would agree with me. I could keep this conversation going for a long time.
A very long time.
I was gonna say, you wrote the article before the talk, so you get a lot of the credit for kicking this off. You beat me to it.
Yeah, I didn't even know we were gonna do that talk at the time, so yeah, it worked out. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you.
This was great. Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on.